before we get started, I want to issue an apology. You all, I kind of fibbed last time I was here. So the National Liberation Front, which included non-communists, was formed in 1960 by the Central Committee of the Communist Party. That is an exclusively a Russian operation, right? Its military arm was officially named the People's Liberation Armed Forces, the PLAF, which became more widely known as the Viet Cong. Now, the Viet Minh was separate from the NLF. This is what I said last time. I said that the NLF was sort of like another name for the Viet Minh. That's not entirely true. The Viet Minh was formed in China, as point of fact, in May of 1941 by Ho Chi Minh. The predecessor to the Viet Minh was the Indochina Communist Party, which was formed in 1930 by Ho Chi Minh, because the original goal was to liberate all of French Indochina and turn the entire region, to convert the entire region into a Soviet client state. That would include Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and even Thailand. But, you know, communism didn't really flourish and flow into Thailand as they had wished. And the man who I alluded to in part one of this talk, whose name I couldn't recall at the time, who was a Soviet Comintern agent, he was the one who tipped the first domino in Southeast Asia. I couldn't remember his name, but his name is Mikhail Borodin. He was a chief Comintern agent who was sent into China in the 1920s and helped plant the seed of communism in East and Southeast Asia. Borodin, in 1906, he immigrated to the United States, where he attended Valparaiso University in Indiana and founded a school for Soviet defectors. In 1949, when Stalin began a purge of Soviet Russia's Jewish intellectuals, Borodin was arrested and sent to a labor camp in Siberia, where he died just a few years later. That's the fate and the life of Mikhail Borodin. So the Democratic Republic of the Congo, of course, was not Zimbabwe. It was never Zimbabwe. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is still the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Of course, it won its independence from Belgium in 1960. And the Democratic Republic of the Congo has been communist from the day of its independence until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. Zimbabwe was, of course, the former Rhodesia. I said too that, you know, with the episode when Frank Marshall Davis was there was an attempted lynching of Frank Marshall Davis when he was 5 years old. Of course, I said a white stranger saved his life and escorted him the rest of the way home. I said they walked 5 miles, but it was only a 1 mile walk, according to Davis, not a 5 mile walk. And of course, I talked about the Montgomery bus boycott, which occurred in 1955, and I talked about the march that happened in 65. Again, the boycott was 55. The marches were in 65, and those marches occurred from Selma to Montgomery. I don't know why I had Birmingham on the brain, but anyway, James Ford, the black communist, he was he was one of the founders of the National Negro Congress, which was founded in the city of Chicago. He was a Communist Party candidate for vice president in 1932, 36, and 1940. I said 1931. I don't know why I said that when I meant to say 1932. And the chief editor of The God Who Failed, A Confession, if you're interested, his name is Richard Crossman, not Grossman. I think I called him Grossman. His name is Richard Crossman. And the Republican Party candidate for president in 1940 that Frank Marshall Davis campaigned for was Wendell Willkie, not William Willkie. Now that we got that out the way, let's get into it. Okay, so I'm going to start off here. Here is an excerpt from Paul Robeson's letter titled "To My Beloved Comrade." Some of you are probably familiar with this letter. This was written in 1953 after the death of Joseph Stalin. So Paul Robeson is writing in 1953 to a now dead Joseph Stalin. These are just excerpts. Today in Korea, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America and the West Indies, in the Middle East, in Africa, one sees tens of millions of long oppressed colonial peoples surging toward freedom. What courage, what sacrifice, what determination, never to rest until victory. In all spheres of modern life, the influence of Stalin reaches wide and deep. From his last simply written but vastly discerning and comprehensive document, back through the years, his contributions to the science of our world society remain invaluable. Think about who he's talking about. He's talking about Joseph Stalin, this Paul Robeson. One reverently speaks of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin. He's saying he reverently speaks of them. He calls them the shapers of our humanity's richest present and future. Yes, through his deep humanity, by his wise understanding, he leaves us a rich and monumental heritage. Most importantly, he has charted the direction of our present and future struggles. He has pointed the way to peace, to friendly coexistence, to the exchange of mutual scientific and cultural contributions, to the end of war and destruction. How consequently, how patiently he labored for peace and ever-increasing abundance with what deep kindliness and wisdom he leaves tens of millions all over the world bowed in heart-aching grief. But he as well knows the struggle continues. So inspired by his noble example, let us lift our heads slowly but proudly high and march forward in the fight for peace, for a rich and rewarding life for all. So this is Paul Robeson. This is part of Paul Robeson's farewell to Joseph Stalin. Now, Frank Marshall Davis uttered similar flights of fancy nearly a decade earlier. I'm going to read from Frank Marshall Davis. Here he wrote, this is probably in the Chicago Star. He wrote, August 24th, 1946. The article was titled, "Our International Klansmen." I'm reading these things so you all can get the idea of what was going on in the mind, the hive mind of the left in the 1940s. And I want you to kind of think about that while you think about the rhetoric of the left today. Here is Frank Marshall Davis. The Ku Klux Klan is international. Maybe you hadn't thought of it this way, but there is a strong similarity between the Negro people of America and the rising people of the rest of the world. Remember. And so here you have Frank Marshall Davis saying the Ku Klux Klan is international because the struggles of the Negro peoples of America are linked to the struggles of the rising people of the rest of the world. He goes on in this 1946 column. The forces supporting racism and attacks on Negroes are the same forces seeking to wreck the new Poland, Yugoslavia, and China, and who want to get tough with Russia. So this is 1946. This was shortly after World War II. Now, we all know what the Soviet Union did after World War II. And then this, of course, began the Cold War, and you had the Truman Doctrine. And then you also had the Marshall Plan. Now, Truman is the Truman Doctrine. Truman was sending aid to Greece, of course, and we all familiar with what happened with the Greek Civil War at the time. And Harry Truman was also sending aid and support to Turkey at the time. And so you had the Soviet Union eyeing Greece and Turkey at the time. This became known as the Truman Doctrine. And then, the Marshall Plan later was, of course, meant to, rebuild Western Europe and all these other things. And so here you have Frank Marshall Davis is saying that, and he's trying to draw sympathy, right, for the reader, because when you think of the Klan, he wants you to think of Americans' foreign policy toward Europe in that part of the Mediterranean. And so here is Frank Marshall Davis saying that the United States, in its efforts to prevent the Soviet Empire from taking over more territories, this was an example of international, almost like, international racism, international Klansmanship. So, you know, so to speak. So again, this is the propaganda of the left. If you're trying to prevent Soviet expansion, then that makes you a racist. That makes you a Ku Klux Klan sympathizer. If Frank Marshall Davis, it was never quite made clear on his behalf exactly why he chose to move to Hawaii. Now, according to Frank Marshall Davis, I think he claims that he and his wife made a trip there at one point and they kind of liked it. And so it's like, you know, let's relocate to Hawaii. I think legend has it, and I covered this in part 1 as well, that it was Paul Robeson who actually convinced Frank Marshall Davis to move to Hawaii in the first place. And remember that Jomo Kenyatta, who was trained in Moscow, was a one-time roommate of Paul Robeson, while Jomo Kenyatta and Paul Robeson were both residing in London, England. And of course, Kenya, we are told, is the native country of Barack Obama Sr., who may or not be Barack Obama's biological father. So you have to understand that. So when it comes to the left, the communist Marxist left, there's this secret clandestine sort of network of, and we actually see a lot of the letters and correspondence that they had with one another. They had secret code names that they would refer to one another. It was just one big, you know, again, the communist conspiracy is an international conspiracy. It is an international criminal conspiracy. And so it may be coincidence, it may not be coincidence that many of these individuals are connected, quite frankly. And so, you know, there are orders, letters, and correspondence between and amongst these individuals. And again, you know, Frank Marshall Davis was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. And so, you know, again, but he makes it seem as though he just went to Hawaii on a whim. I don't believe that. I don't believe that at all. When Frank Marshall Davis was sent to Hawaii, he was given a job as a member of the writing staff of the Honolulu Record, right? And he wrote for the Honolulu Record from, I think it was, 1949 to sometime during the maybe early 1950s. Not quite sure how long he was on staff. But he was brought on to the staff of the Honolulu Record by a man named, remember this name, and I got some information in here about him. He is a man of international intrigue. When you hear his name, this is a man who, when you talk about the Cold War, when you talk about communism, this is a man who doesn't get mentioned often, but he needs to be talked about more if we're going to, you know, shine new light on what happened historically and, you know, why we are in the pickle that we are in today. Frank Marshall Davis was brought on to the staff of the Honolulu Record by a man named Koji Ariyoshi. Some of you may have heard the name. If you're familiar with this type of content, if you've done your research, you are bound to come across the name Koji Ariyoshi. There are 3 men in particular who are deeply connected to Frank Marshall Davis. And I'm going to cover all 3 of them, but I'm going to deal with Koji Ariyoshi first. Now, who is Koji Ariyoshi? Koji Ariyoshi was born in 1914 on a coffee plantation in Kona, on an island called Kilakukua. Ariyoshi, now, if you can't tell by his name, Ariyoshi was of Japanese heritage. You had a lot of Japanese folk who, you know, who were of Japanese descent or who were of Japanese heritage residing on the islands of what would become Hawaii. Okay. If you go back to, of course, you know, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, what was that, 1941? You know, we're all familiar with the controversial Supreme Court decision of, you know, Karamatsu. What was it? Karamatsu v. the United States, which deemed it legal to, you know, round up anyone in the United States of Japanese descent into internment camps. That's the word I was looking for. There were some Japanese Americans that welcomed the internment because they saw it as a means of protection from domestic hostilities from non-Japanese. And also, as point of fact, there were Japanese spy networks in the United States. As a matter of fact, I hate when I do this because I got to go dig it up because I want to tell you guys, and I probably will tell you guys next time. There is I think he was an American national, but he is another American national who is of Japanese heritage, who has done a lot of historical research and data on the goings on back then. And he details that many Japanese folk in the United States had split loyalties, as point of fact, that there were some American-born folk of Japanese descent who were rooting for the Japanese Imperial Army in World War II. And there were, in fact, highly sophisticated Japanese spy networks in the United States, especially on the islands of what would become Hawaii. And if you, for further information on this, you all can read a document known as the Roberts Commission Report. The Roberts Commission Report. Ariyoshi attended high school at Konohana High School before he would move to Honolulu and enroll. Where would he enroll? The University of Hawaii. Prior to his enrollment at U of H, Ariyoshi was already writing for the Honolulu Star Bulletin, detailing what he observed to be the appalling working conditions of Honolulu's plantation and dock workers. Ariyoshi, of course, being a dock worker himself. In 1940, Ariyoshi won a YMCA fellowship to study at the University of Georgia. Now, the YMCA, ladies and gentlemen, has always been heavily involved in these nefarious communist activities, for those of you who don't know. And, of course, you know, with Ariyoshi going to the University of Georgia, we saw, too, remember that Frank Marshall Davis had a brief stint in Atlanta, Georgia, where he worked for a black entrepreneur who owned his own newspaper, a man by the name of W.A. Scott. So it's funny how these folks are kind of like, you know, when they're not in the same place at the same time, it's almost like they're walking in each other's footsteps. While in Georgia, he would stay with the parents of the writer of the famous novel Tobacco Road. Ariyoshi, while attending the University of Georgia, was also exposed to the harsh realities of racial discrimination in the Jim Crow South. I'm not sure what year Ariyoshi officially joined the Communist Party. But by the summer of 1941, he had resettled in San Francisco, where he worked as a dockhand organizing for well-known communist Carl Yaneda, and was active in the, now this here, now remember this, guys, remember this organization here. Ariyoshi was active in the International Longshore and Warehouse Union under the direction of Harry Bridges. And I'm going to talk about Harry Bridges, but remember the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, the ILWU. I'm going to be referring to it as the ILWU primarily from here on out, but that is the International Longshoremen and Warehouse Union under the direction of Harry Bridges. Now, from the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, because, you know, and part of what really helped to radicalize Russia, if you think about it, you know, people have oftentimes tried to criticize me because I play too fast and loose with trying to apply Marxism to everything, right? Because Marxism is an economic theory. The Soviet Union was the first to make Karl Marx's philosophies the governing principles of the state, is what I'm trying to say. So from the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to the rise of Japanese imperialism during World War II, the fact of such Japanese aggression and provocation led Ariyoshi to begin calling for a second front to aid the Soviet Union. Ariyoshi would join the U.S. Army in 1944 and was assigned to participate in the famous Dixie Mission. The Dixie mission's purpose was to connect with Chinese communist guerrillas who were waging a counteroffensive against China's Japanese occupiers. And it was through this experience that Ariyoshi began publicly advocating for the removal of China's nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek in favor of the leader of the Chinese peasants, a man to whom he had come to know personally during his deployment, which was, of course, Mao Zedong. By 1948, Ariyoshi had returned to Hawaii and, with the backing of the ILWU, had founded the radical left-wing publication, the Honolulu Record. And soon thereafter, he would go on to hire fellow traveler Frank Marshall Davis. Now, one more aside, when it came to Ariyoshi was charged and convicted as a member of the infamous Honolulu 7. Understand that it was virtually the Communist Party that created the Hawaii that we know today. Hawaii gained its statehood thanks to the efforts of the Communist Party and those working on an individual level and those working on behalf of the Communist Party. According to the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies at the University of Washington, Harry Bridges was one of the most, this is a quote on their website, Harry Bridges was one of the most influential labor leaders in United States history. Again, Harry Bridges, he's like an icon to the labor unions. In 1934, in the wake of the Great Maritime Strike, you can go, guys can go and look up the Great Maritime Strike, the socialist militant, my description, Harry Bridges, would become the leader of the International Longshoremen and Warehousemen's Union from 1934 to his retirement in 1977. Remember, I spoke about Frank Marshall Davis and his weekly column. His weekly column in the Honolulu Record was titled Frankly Speaking. The Honolulu Record was published for and by the AWLU. So the Honolulu Record was the official paper of the ILWU. Here is an excerpt from his September 22nd, 1949, Frankly Speaking column titled Cold War in Church. The Cold War policies of the bipartisans administered by their thought control police are aimed against such Negroes as Paul Robeson, who thinks American democracy could learn about race relations from Russia. Such leaders as Harry Bridges, who oppose Taft-Hartley and the imperialistic Marshall Plan. The militias, they were a bunch of Soviet sympathizing pastors. And so, yes, you all should get to know William and John Mellish just to get an understanding of the infiltration of communism in the Protestant church. But anyway, moving on. Who believe the Soviet Union and the United States can live peacefully in the same world. Again, they use the church to try and weaken the United States militarily because they knew that that would aid their emperor, Joseph Stalin. The church's attitude, from the Dr. John Howard Mellishes of the world, fast forward to the MLKs of the world, that as good Christians are always for peace, you see. And so, blessed were the peacemakers was the common refrain of the social justice Protestant. And so, if the United States was trying to meet the Soviet Union head on, then of course we were the ones that were in the wrong because we were provoking this war. Here's another one of Davis's weekly column in the Record. This was one he published a couple of weeks earlier on September 1st of the same year, 1949. This was titled "Democracy is Indivisible." He says in this column titled "Democracy is Indivisible," he says, an amazingly large number of Negroes have observed the forces who shout loudest about the communist menace are the same forces who won't extend equal rights to minority groups. You see what he's doing? They realize also that if the civil rights of communists can be taken away in complete defiance of the federal constitution, then it will be much easier to grab back those democratic rights that minority groups have won through long and painful struggle. Do you see the propaganda? He's telling folks that if you are aligned with anti-communists and the Joe McCarthy's of the world and the J. Edgar Hoovers of the world, even though, and I've said this last time, that there was perhaps no president in American history that the communists despise more than Harry Truman. Even you talk about Ronald Reagan, hell, even a man in Woodrow Wilson, who I am no huge fan of, to his credit, was vehemently opposed to Bolshevism. All you gotta do is just go and look up Woodrow Wilson's speeches and writings and look up his attitudes toward Bolshevism. Anyway, but you see the propaganda. What Frank Marshall Davis is saying is that if you support our government's efforts in flushing out and exposing the communist menace to the wider American public, then you are at the same time opposed to the civil rights gains of African Americans, because they're under the pretense of stomping out communism domestically. They're going to use that to also attack the civil rights gains of the Negro. You see this game that he's playing. The left is doing the same thing today. It's not even subtle. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. But it's not about the free speech of the communists. It's about their subversion and their clandestine activities to overthrow the very Constitution that they hide behind. It has also been asked how the United States expects to rule Russia when the federal government can't rule Mississippi. Some cynics have suggested that the reason for the scarcity of democracy throughout the mainland comes from the amount we have exported to Greece and Turkey. So again, Frank Marshall Davis is saying that the reason why we cannot root out racism in America is because America is too fixated, meaning the federal government is too fixated on sending aid to Greece and Turkey. The same source of complaints was being circulated by the left during the 1960s by the likes of MLK and the entire anti-war contingent in America, because we had no business sending foreign aid to Southeast Asia when we still had so many problems domestically, because in their minds, resources in wealth and property reallocation is going to fix the problems of America's underclass. The fact of Harry Bridges' Communist Party membership was attested to by a man named Richard St. Clair, who was a former guard at a local Communist Party headquarters, who said that other communists told him, quote, "Yes, Bridges is one of us, but keep your mouth shut about it." This was reported in the San Francisco News on April 23rd, 1941. Also, confessed communists such as Richard Wilmot and Nat Honig testified in Bridges' deportation and perjury hearings that he, Bridges, was in fact a communist. Now, I know you're like, perjury and deportation. What do you mean deportation? Well, Harry Bridges was born in Melbourne, Australia. He was not an American citizen. Also, another key member of the ILWU who was also connected with Frank Marshall Davis is a man by the name of Jack Hall. Now, who is Jack Hall? Jack Hall was born in 1915 and was director of organization for the ILWU and one of its two vice presidents before dying of a stroke in 1971. Now, the Communist Party of Hawaii was actually founded, I felt the need to put this in here, was actually founded by a CPUSA member by the name of Bill Bailey. He was a New Yorker. Bill Bailey was sent by the party to organize the dock and agricultural workers in Hawaii, sort of like Davis, right? Everybody's getting summoned to Hawaii. And the charter membership of the party, which was founded in 1937, was 12 members at 10 cents per member to join. Among the 12, These were the 12 charter members of the Communist Party of Hawaii, founded in 1937 by Bill Bailey. Among them were Jack Hall and Harry Bridges. Now, just to close out on the ILWU, the union virtually merged with the Democrat Party to form the most powerful civil and political coalition on the islands of Hawaii. No Democrat politician was elected without the endorsement of the ILWU. I need you all to understand this. Believe it or not now, prior to the 1940s, Hawaii's legislature had been dominated by the Republican Party for 50 consecutive years. And so it was through the ILWU that the Communist Party was successful in seizing political control in Hawaii. Let's go to why you all came here. I know it's painstaking, y'all. The Dunhams and Barack Obama Sr. Just going to give you a little background on the Dunhams and Barack Obama Sr. Now, the Dunhams moved to Hawaii from Seattle in 1960 when Madeline Dunham was offered a job at the Bank of Hawaii, while Stanley Armour Dunham worked for a furniture store. Now, Barack Obama Sr. was a goat herder in rural Kenya before winning a scholarship to study in the United States. Stanley Ann Dunham, daughter of Madeline and Stanley Armour Dunham, would meet Barack Obama Sr. at the University of Hawaii in a Russian language class. Now, wait a minute. Now, let me just ask y'all a question. Does that strike anyone as odd? Or maybe it's just coincidental. But why this interest in learning Russian? Now, rumor has it that the FBI had Stanley Dunham, father, Stanley Armour Dunham, under watch, but his FBI file at some point was destroyed. Now, they married, meaning Barack Obama Sr. and Stanley Ann Dunham. They married in 1961. They separated in 1962. That didn't last long. They officially divorced in 1964. Now, remember, I talked about the Kenyatta-Obama connection, right? Jomo Kenyatta, who would eventually become the president of Kenya, and Jomo Kenyatta and his connection to the Soviet Union. And, of course, Paul Robeson knew Jomo Kenyatta personally, and he also knew Frank Marshall Davis personally. And Frank Marshall Davis may very well had known Obama Sr. personally. Now, allow me to explain. Now, it's weird because, see, when Barack Obama published his memoir, Dreams for My Father, in 1995, I don't know if Barack Obama knew exactly what was on the political horizon for him. There was a New York Times article published in April of 1953 that actually referred to Jomo Kenyatta as a Soviet-trained terrorist, which he was. This is conventional knowledge. This is common wisdom. Again, he became the president of Kenya. Now, the connection between Kenyatta and Barack Obama Sr. is not lost on Barack Obama Jr. either. Obama Jr., in his memoir, Dreams for My Father, mentions Kenyatta nearly a dozen times. While attending U of H, mind you, guess who else attended the University of Hawaii? Koji Oriyoshi. I mentioned him earlier. While attending U of H, Barack Obama Sr. would meet a fellow exchange student, an economics major from Cambodia named Tith. Now, who said of Barack Obama Sr., this is the Cambodian exchange student that Barack Obama Sr. knew. He says of Barack Obama Sr., quote, this is Tith, Obama and I were on opposite poles. I did not believe communism could save the world. It was too good to be true. And I gave examples of what I had seen. Barack Obama Sr. was the opposite. He was always glorying about how communism had liberated Africa and Cuba. He had no idea what communism was all about. For him, communism was going to save the world and capitalism was going to collapse. Again, you know, this is quite insightful of Tith because this was long before, as a Cambodian national, this was long before the Phnom Penh incident and the Cambodian genocide that began in 1975 in the reign of Pol Pot in the Khmer Rouge. And Dunham had a similar attitude toward American democracy and communism. Of course, this according to Barack Obama's senior biographer, a woman by the name of Sally Jacobs. Now, it is not clear, and I alluded to this moments ago, that it is not clear when Davis, that is Frank Marshall Davis, met the Dunhams. We don't quite know when. He was just there one day, right? And we'll get into some of these stories. And a lot of these stories are from Barack Obama himself. It is quite possible that Davis knew Barack Obama Sr. as well. Barack Obama Sr., and this is the connection that we draw. Barack Obama Sr. once famously spoke at a peace rally in Ala Moana Park on the island of Oahu at the Mother's Day Peace Rally on May 13th, 1962, where he recited a fiery speech demanding that the United States reduce its military spending amidst the Cold War. What organization do you reckon was conspicuously present at this function? Well, of course, it was the ILWU. They were at this Mother's Day Peace Rally where Barack Obama Sr. delivered this speech. Even if you go to, I think the ILWU is still a functioning union, last time I checked. If you go to, they have pictures and photographs and things like that on their website. And at their headquarters, there's actually a kind of display that they have dedicated to, of course, the Obamas and whatever. And they actually have a photograph, and you can go and look up the photograph of Obama Sr. at this 1962 event where he's up at the podium giving this speech. And it's on the ILWU website. Frank even spoke about the presence of African exchange students at UH in his later memoirs. He even talks about perhaps Barack Obama Sr. himself, but we don't know because he doesn't mention him by name. He just talked about this striking, intelligent, well-spoken Kenyan exchange student who he, quote, says impregnated a pretty blonde woman before he went back to his native country. The Dunhams, as a family, now I felt the need to talk about this. It is widely documented were full-blown atheists by the 1960s, as was Frank Marshall Davis. I talked about that in part one, where Frank Marshall Davis abandoned his belief in God because God did not answer his prayers when it came to punishing the white race. In Barack Obama Jr.'s 2006 book, The Audacity of Hope, Barack Obama wrote, quote, "I was not raised in a religious household. My mother's own experiences only reinforced this inherited skepticism. Her memories of the Christians who populated her youth were not fond ones." Barack Obama Jr. also goes on in The Audacity of Hope that, quote, "Religion for her was just one of the many ways, and not necessarily the best way, that man attempted to control the unknowable and understand the deeper truths of our lives." Obama would later go on to say in December of 2007 to NBC journalist Aswani Anbarajan about the rumor that he is a closeted Muslim, quote, "My father was from Kenya, and a lot of people in his village were Muslim. He, his father, didn't practice Islam. Truth is, he wasn't very religious." Of course he wouldn't be. He's a communist. "He met my mother. My mother was a Christian from Kansas. So I've always been a Christian. I've never practiced Islam." Now, you see the duplicitous nature in Obama. You see what he does here. It's funny, too, because the rumors about Barack Obama not being an American citizen came out of his own camp, as point of fact. And it's funny how they tried to say, well, anyone who questions Barack Obama's citizenship is a racist. This is what they tried to do to President Trump. But remember, the rumors and accusations about Barack Obama being a closeted Muslim and about Barack Obama being an Indonesian or Kenyan citizen or something of that nature was popularized first by his own Democratic rivals vying for the nomination in 2008, most notably Hillary Clinton. And she disguised her questioning or skepticism about Barack Obama's citizenship and other things. She disguised it by saying that you, Barack Obama Jr., should answer this question, because most certainly if you were to gain the nomination, your Republican challenger is going to ask you these same questions. So you should do yourself a favor and address those concerns right here and now. Now, first, he says in 2006 that he didn't grow up in a religious household. He inherited this kind of religious skepticism by his mom, who was not a practicing Christian. Now, fast forward in 2007, in the lead up to the 2008 election, he knows that he has to feign some sort of allegiance to the Christian faith if he is to become president of the United States. Again, I don't knock him for lying. Politicians lie all the time. Democrats, Republicans, they all lie. But again, Barack Obama didn't do himself any favors by releasing these quasi-tell-all memoirs. Now, Ann Dunham's best friend in high school, a woman by the name of Maxine Box, said to a Chicago Tribune reporter named Tim Jones in March of 2007 that Ann, quote, touted herself an atheist, and it was something she'd read about and could argue. So according to Stanley Ann Dunham's best friend, Maxine Box, she was, in fact, an atheist. While Maya Sotoro, Ann Dunham's daughter, the sister of Barack Obama, said of her mother, I wouldn't have called her an atheist. She was an agnostic. She basically gave us all the good books and wanted us to recognize that everyone has something beautiful to contribute. Now, y'all, let's get back to the story of when Harry met Sally, when Obama met Frank. Let's talk about it. And it all centers around the story of the black panhandler. Barack Obama Jr. at the time still referred to himself as Barry. As you tell people, because, of course, Barack Obama's a weird sounding name, so he liked to be called Barry. Was suffering from what I myself call the Kaepernick syndrome, due to the lack of a black male role model for him to connect with. This is Barack Obama's own description, right? Because he was being raised by his white grandparents, and being a biracial child, he felt somewhat empty. He was longing for some sort of connection with a black male role model. At this point, the young Obama only had the letters of his father to lean on for any sort of black masculine connection. Of course, part of what helped to cement the bond between Frank Marshall Davis and Barack Obama was the fact that Barack Obama was biracial. And as I outlined in part 1, for those of you who did not know, Frank Marshall Davis's wife was white, and Frank Marshall Davis himself had biracial children. Obama noted in his 1995 memoir that his grandfather had a fair slate of black male friends that he played cards with. A young Obama would attend these card game gatherings with his grandfather, where his grandfather's black friends were always pleasant when greeting him, but once the games began, Obama went ignored for the duration of the gathering, except for one man, a poet named Frank. This is how Barack Obama would describe him, a poet named Frank. As time went on, it became routine for Obama and his grandfather, Stanley, to visit Davis to sit around, drink whiskey, read poetry, and tell dirty jokes about women. And this is notorious. Frank Marshall Davis was notorious for his sort of crude and lewd remarks, and even in his own literature, when it came to his attitudes and his beliefs about women or whatnot. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but Frank Marshall Davis wrote a memoir under a pseudonym that was published sometime during the 1930s called Black Rebel. And then he would come along later, maybe in his other 1944, I think it was the year, memoir titled Living the Blues, where he admitted that he was, in fact, the author of Black Rebel. And in Black Rebel, he details all of his sexual exploits, even a sexual relationship that he had with a 13-year-old. This is Frank Marshall Davis. Anyway, so he was a bit of a pornographer as well, and we all know anyway. So again, at this time, I talked to Ann Dunham and Barack Obama Sr., right? The meeting up between the three of them at Hawaii. Obama would state in his autobiography that he knew Frank was, and I'm paraphrasing here, enjoyed some notoriety in his early life. He doesn't quite see, here's the thing. Barack Obama was not dishonest enough to the point where he would be willing to leave Frank Marshall Davis out of his memoir completely. He did not have the gall to do such a thing to a man who had played such a big role in his development in his teenage years. He couldn't bear the thought of doing that. But he knew very well who Frank Marshall Davis was, about Frank Marshall Davis's past. And that's why I believe that he neglected to mention Frank Marshall Davis by his name in full. Because he knew Frank Marshall Davis was a member of the Communist Party. He even cited, this is Barack Obama Jr., he even cited Frank Marshall Davis's connections to his literary counterparts, Richard Wright and Langston Hughes, who too were both members of the Communist Party. So Barack Obama knew. Now, the story of the black panhandler. Let me get to this. Let me run through this. Obama's grandmother, Madeline, that he referred to as Toot, had a dispute with Barack Obama's grandfather, who he referred to as Gramps, over whether Gramps should give Toot a ride to work after she had been threatened at a bus stop by a black panhandler. Now, according to Obama's account, the issue as he perceived it centered around the race of the beggar, not the reality of the person simply being a beggar. You get what I'm saying? So it's not that she was being accosted and hassled by a random stranger at a bus stop. The fact that the person was black made it, I guess, doubly concerning. And so, troubled by his grandparents' racist behavior, Obama sought out the counsel of Frank, because this was the first time, according to Obama, that he witnessed his grandparents engaging in what he perceived to be, I guess, sort of like, sort of racist attitudes. It troubled him. So he wanted to figure out exactly, or process exactly how, what should he feel about, what should he think about this? Here is Frank Marshall Davis's words to a young Obama. Listen to what he says to him. You can't blame Stan for what he is. He's basically a good man. What I'm trying to tell you is your grandma is right to be scared. She's at least as right as Stanley is. She understands that black people have a reason to hate. That's just how it is. For your sake, I wish it were otherwise, but it is not. So you might as well get used to it. Black people have a reason to hate. So you see what they're gearing up for? They're seeing how they are going to use, blacks as some sort of vigilante sort of force in the United States. And the wider society is expected to just sit there and take it because we have a reason to hate. This is propaganda. Obama remarked that he walked away from that conversation realizing for the first time that, quote, I was alone. And it was from that point that Obama felt closer to Obama felt closer to Davis than his own biological grandfather. This start to set the radical wheels in motion for young Obama. Obama's connection to Davis would continue to grow, seeing the two sit down for conversations several more times before perhaps the second most seminal exchange between them would occur, when Obama would visit Davis before moving to Los Angeles to enroll in Occidental College in 1979. About what Obama should expect from his college experience. At this point, Obama was just going through the motions. He thought college was just something that you do. But, he wasn't necessarily too gung-ho about it. And he didn't know what lay ahead of him in the future. So he went to Frank Marshall Davis. Frank says, this is his remarks to a young Obama. They train you so good that you'll start believing what they tell you about equal opportunity and the American way and all that shit. You may be a well-trained, well-paid nigger, but you're a nigger just the same. Wow. What inspiration. Way to go, Frank. What a message to give to a young, impressionable mind going into the world. That no matter how well trained you are, no matter how well paid you are, you ain't shit but a nigga. Frank Marshall Davis is all of about 80-some years old at this point. And this is what he's telling a young Obama. And so, this is the lasting lesson Obama would take into his college sojourn. And what of Obama in college? Well, for that, let's turn to the words of Dr. John C. Drew. Who is Dr. John C. Drew? He was born February 5th, 1957 in Glendale, California. Dr. John Drew earned his PhD in government from Cornell and has taught political science and economics at Cornell, Hope International University, the University of Oregon, and Williams College. Today, Dr. Drew remains active in political and economic matters and is an occasional contributor to some of the most notable conservative publications in the country, including The American Thinker, Breitbart, Campus Reform, PJ Media, The College Fix, Front Page Magazine, and World Net Daily. Now, let's rewind a bit when it comes to Dr. Drew. Back in 1975, Dr. Drew received an athletic scholarship in track to attend Occidental College. And yes, he knew Barack Obama. Now, I just want to give this a little tidbit. I thought this was an interesting story. One of Dr. Drew's last professorships took place at Williams College, where he was virtually run out by students and administrators when he was denied tenure. This is why I don't think he teaches anymore. He was denied tenure once a group of conservative students looking for campus support discovered that Dr. Drew was only one of 3 Republicans on a faculty of approximately 100. For those of my math and my arithmetic illiterate folks out there, that's 3%. 3% of Williams College's faculty were registered Republicans. And the trend can be found all across our American university archipelago. Same deal. They were looking for support, and they discovered that Drew was, in fact, one of very few Republicans. And so it wasn't purposeful, but they sort of outed him as a conservative. And from there, his teaching career was over. Now, Dr. Drew, now a staunch conservative, is a recovering Marxist who was a founding member of the Political Awareness Fellowship, a Marxist student organization, as an undergrad at Occidental. Now, let's hear what Dr. Drew has said over the years about his one-time friend and comrade. In 1980, Dr. John Drew, he wasn't a doctor then, but in 1980, John Drew was a second-year graduate student, then 23 years old, was dating another Occidental student who was 21 years old, a woman named Caroline Boss, who had met and befriended Obama, then Barry, in a political theory class. Dr. Drew met Obama at Caroline Boss's home that year, shortly before the new year. This is 1980. This is what Dr. Drew recalls of the meeting. I had been an angry Marxist revolutionary during my undergraduate career at Occidental College. During my hyperactive sophomore year in the fall of 1976, I founded the Marxist Socialist Group on campus and named it the Political Awareness Fellowship. As I recall, I had developed this innocuous sounding name because there were so few students on campus as radical as I, and I was fearful of turning off moderate students who might be willing to learn more about Marxist theory. When I first saw Obama, I remember standing on the porch of Boss's parents' impressive home as a sleek, expensive luxury car pulled up to the driveway. 2 young men emerged from the vehicle. They were well-dressed and looked like they were born to wealth and privilege. I was a little surprised to learn they were Boss's friends from Occidental College until she articulated the underlying political connection. "They're on our side," she said. "This is Barack Obama," Boss said. I remember I looked up at Obama as we shook hands. I was completely mystified by the pronunciation of his name. He did not put up a fight over it, however, you can call me Barry, Obama said. My graduate studies that fall had tempered my earlier Marxism with a more realistic perspective. Now listen to this. I thought a revolution was not in the cards anymore. There was no inevitability in my mind to the old idea that the proletariat would rise up and overthrow the ruling classes. Now the idea that we could entirely eliminate the profit motive from an advanced industrialized economy seemed like childhood fantasy. The future I now thought would belong to nations with mixed economic systems, like those in Europe, where there was government planning of the economy combined with a greater effort to produce more equitable distribution of wealth. Doesn't that sound like the modern day Democrat Party platform, ladies and gentlemen? It made more sense to me to focus on elections rather than on preparing for a coming revolution. Boss and Obama, however, had a starkly different view. They believed that the economic stresses of the Carter years meant revolution was imminent. The election of Reagan was simply a minor setback in terms of the coming revolution. As I recall, Obama repeatedly used the phrase, "when the revolution comes." In my mind, I remember thinking that Obama was blindly sticking to the simple Marxist theory that had characterized my own views while I was an undergraduate at Occidental College. There's going to be a revolution, Obama said. We need to be organized and grow the movement. In Obama's view, our role might be to educate others so that we might usher in more quickly this inevitable revolution. I know this may be implausible to some readers, but I distinctly remember Obama surprising me by bringing up Frantz Fanon and colonialism. I did that last time. He impressed me with his knowledge of these two topics which were not among my strong points or of overwhelming concern to me. Drawing on the history of Western Europe, I responded it was unrealistic to think the working class would ever overthrow the capitalist system. I recall Obama reacting negatively to my criticism, saying, "You're crazy." Since I was a Marxist myself at the time and had studied variations in Marxist theory, I can state that everything I heard Obama argue that evening was consistent with Marxist philosophy, including the ideas that class struggle was leading to an inevitable revolution, that an elite group of revolutionaries was needed to lead the effort. It had not been a true Marxist-Leninist. If he had not been a true Marxist-Leninist, I would have noticed and remembered. I can still, with some degree of ideological precision, identify which students at Occidental College were radicals and which ones were not. By the time the debate came to an end, Obama, although not boss, were making peace, agreeing with the facts I had laid out, and demonstrating an apparent agreement with more realistic perspective. I have vivid memory of Obama surrendering to my argument, including signaling to the somewhat bewildered Chandu. Chandu was the gentleman who Barack Obama rode with when, Obama was with this gentleman Chandu, and the two of them are the two that arrived at the home of Caroline Boss. And Chandu, I think his father, they were wealthy. He came from a wealthy Indian family. A bewildered Chandu, through his voice and body language, that the argument had concluded and it was decided in my favor. Drew said, "I won the argument." Listen to this. I treasured this particular memory as an early example of my own intellectual growth and an early sign of my moderate promise as a teacher. At the time, I had the impression that I might have been one of the first to directly challenge Obama's Marxist-Leninist mindset. Whatever impact our encounter might have had on him, I know something about what Barack Obama believed in 1980. At the time, the future president was a doctrinaire Marxist revolutionary, although perhaps for the first time considered conventional politics as a more practical road to socialism. Thank y'all for joining me. Please like, subscribe, share, do all those YouTube things. Thank you.